The black car stopped outside a small restaurant on the edge of town, and Vincent Morty stepped out with his eyes fixed on the door. He had not planned to stop here. His driver had simply needed fuel, and the diner across the street looked like the fastest place to grab a coffee before his next meeting. Vincent walked in without a second thought, straightening his jacket, his mind already on numbers and names for the deal ahead. Then he saw her, and every thought in his head disappeared at once. Alina stood behind the counter, balancing a tray of plates on one arm, her other hand resting briefly on her rounded stomach. She looked tired in a way he had never seen before, her hair pulled back loosely, her apron stained from a long shift. For a moment, Vincent thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It had been 5 years since he last saw her face, 5 years since she walked out of his house and out of his life, telling him she could not build a family with a man who lived by fear and control. He stood frozen near the entrance, unable to move forward or turn away. The restaurant buzzed around him, forks clinking, someone laughing near the window, but none of it reached him. All he could see was Alina, older now, softer in some ways and harder in others, carrying a child that was clearly close to being born. His heart pounded in a way it had not in years, not during business threats, not during tense negotiations, not even when rivals tried to test his patience. A waitress brushed past him, breaking the spell just enough for him to step further inside. He chose a table near the back, close enough to watch without being obvious, though nothing about Vincent Morty walking into a small-town diner could ever be called subtle. 2 of his men followed quietly behind him, taking their seats at a nearby table, their eyes scanning the room out of habit rather than real concern. Alina had not noticed him yet. She moved between tables with practiced ease, despite the visible weight she now carried. Vincent watched her laugh softly at something an elderly customer said, and the sound hit him harder than any memory could have. It reminded him of mornings that felt like they belonged to another lifetime, mornings when she used to tease him about his coffee order, and he used to pretend to be annoyed. He wondered how she had ended up here, working long hours on tired feet while pregnant, so far from the comfortable life she once had. Questions built up in his mind faster than he could sort through them. Who was the father? Why was she alone? Had something happened to make her leave the city entirely? Before he could decide whether to approach her or simply watch from a distance, Alina turned toward his table with a notepad in hand, ready to take his order. Her eyes lifted from the paper, met his, and widened in complete shock. The notepad slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the floor between them. Alina bent down quickly to pick up the notepad, her hands trembling slightly as she straightened back up. She stared at Vincent as if she were looking at a ghost, her breath catching in her throat. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. The restaurant noise seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the 2 of them locked in a silence full of memories neither had fully let go. Vincent stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movement that might frighten her. He noticed her step back slightly, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, as if shielding the child from a world she had worked hard to escape. That single gesture told him more than words ever could. Whatever had happened after their separation, she had built a new life, one she clearly wanted to protect from him. He spoke first, his voice quieter than the tone people usually associated with him. He asked how she had been, though the question felt small compared to everything he wanted to say. Alina did not answer right away. Instead, she asked him what he was doing there, her voice sharp with a mixture of surprise and old frustration. She reminded him, without raising her voice, that she had left that life behind for a reason, and she had no interest in reopening old wounds. Vincent explained honestly that he had not come looking for her. Fate, or simple bad luck depending on how she saw it, had brought him to this diner. Alina studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, but found none. She sighed and glanced around at the other customers, aware that people were beginning to notice the tension between them. She led him to a quieter corner table, away from curious eyes, and finally sat down across from him, resting a hand on her lower back as she lowered herself into the chair. Vincent asked the question that had been building inside him since he first saw her. He asked about the child, careful to keep his tone gentle rather than demanding. Alina hesitated before answering. She explained that after their divorce she had remarried, hoping for a simpler, safer life. But when complications arose during her pregnancy, her husband could not handle the pressure and left without warning, leaving her to face everything alone. She admitted with visible reluctance that she had been working long shifts just to cover her medical bills and rent, refusing help from anyone who reminded her of a life she wanted to forget. Vincent listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as anger built inside him, not at Alina, but at the man who had abandoned her when she needed support the most. He fought the urge to ask for a name, aware that his reaction would only make her more uneasy. Instead, he asked if she had anyone helping her now, any family nearby to lean on during such a difficult time. Alina shook her head slowly, admitting that she was mostly on her own, relying on the kindness of a few coworkers and the income from her shifts. She insisted she was managing fine, though the tiredness in her voice told a different story. Vincent felt something shift inside him, a mixture of guilt for the years he had let slip away and a growing determination to make sure she never had to face this alone again. Vincent asked Alina if she would allow him to help, even in a small way, but she refused almost immediately. She reminded him that the last time she depended on him, her life had been filled with constant worry, watching over her shoulder, wondering if every knock on the door meant trouble. She had chosen this hard, tiring life because it came with peace, and she was not willing to trade that peace for comfort again. Vincent understood her fear, though it still stung to hear it spoken so plainly. He told her that things had changed for him too, that he had spent the last few years trying to shift his business toward legitimate ventures, distancing himself from the more dangerous parts of his past. Alina raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, though something in his tone made her pause instead of dismissing him outright. Their conversation was interrupted when Alina winced suddenly, pressing a hand against her side. Vincent immediately leaned forward, concern replacing every other emotion on his face. She assured him it was nothing serious, just the baby shifting position, something that had been happening more often as her due date approached. Still, Vincent noticed the exhaustion behind her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her glass of water. He asked when she was due, and Alina admitted it was only a few weeks away. She confessed, almost reluctantly, that she had been putting off some medical appointments because of the cost, choosing instead to work extra shifts to save money for the baby's arrival. Vincent's expression hardened slightly, not out of anger toward her, but out of frustration that she felt forced into such a difficult choice. He offered, carefully and without pressure, to cover her medical expenses, framing it as something he wanted to do for the child rather than for her. Alina crossed her arms, clearly torn between her pride and the practical reality of her situation. She reminded him that accepting help from him came with complications, reminders of a world she had worked hard to leave behind. Vincent promised her that this offer came with no strings attached, no expectations of anything in return. He simply could not walk away knowing she was struggling while he had more than enough resources to help. Alina studied him for a long moment, trying to detect any hidden motive, but found only sincerity in his expression, a side of him she rarely saw during their marriage. Before she could respond, one of the other waitresses called her name, letting her know a group of customers needed attention. Alina stood slowly, thanking Vincent for his concern but making no promises about his offer. As she walked away, Vincent remained seated, watching her move carefully between tables, his mind racing with thoughts about how he could support her without overwhelming her fragile trust. His men exchanged glances from their table, unsure what to make of their usually unshakable boss looking so visibly affected by a simple conversation. Vincent barely noticed them. His thoughts stayed fixed on Alina, the child she carried, and the quiet realization that he was not ready to let her walk out of his life again without at least trying to make things right. Over the following days, Vincent found reasons to return to the small diner, always careful not to make Alina feel pressured or watched. He would sit quietly, order simple meals, and leave generous tips without drawing attention to himself. Slowly, without any grand gestures, he began arranging things behind the scenes, quietly paying off her outstanding medical bills through a private clinic, and ensuring she had access to proper prenatal care without her having to ask. Alina noticed the changes almost immediately, confused at first when the clinic informed her that her balance had been cleared. She confronted Vincent about it during one of his visits, her tone caught between gratitude and frustration. He admitted honestly that he had arranged it, insisting once again that he expected nothing in return. Alina wanted to be angry, but the relief of not worrying about hospital bills outweighed her hesitation. As weeks passed, their conversations grew longer and more comfortable. Vincent began showing up not just as a customer, but as someone genuinely interested in her well-being, asking about her rest, her appointments, and how she was feeling each day. Alina found herself softening, cautiously allowing him back into small parts of her life, though she remained careful not to move too quickly. One evening, as Alina finished a particularly long shift, she felt a wave of dizziness overcome her while carrying a tray. Vincent, who happened to be there finishing his coffee, reacted instantly, rushing to her side before she could lose her balance completely. He guided her gently to a chair, calling for water and instructing one of his men to bring the car around immediately. Alina tried to insist she was fine, but Vincent refused to take any chances, especially given how close she was to her due date. He personally drove her to the clinic himself, staying by her side through every check, refusing to leave despite her protests that he did not need to stay. The doctors confirmed she was simply exhausted and needed proper rest, but the scare reminded both of them how fragile the situation truly was. That night, sitting outside the clinic waiting room, Alina finally allowed herself to be honest with Vincent. She admitted that she had been terrified of raising the baby completely alone, terrified of failing as a mother without any support system nearby. Vincent listened patiently, resisting the urge to make promises he could not fully guarantee, instead offering steady reassurance that she would not have to face any of it by herself if she did not want to. For the first time since seeing her in the restaurant, Alina allowed herself to lean slightly into his presence, accepting comfort she had refused for years. Vincent felt a quiet sense of purpose settle over him, something he had not experienced in a long time, stronger than any success he had built through his business dealings. He knew that earning back her full trust would take time, but he was determined to prove, through consistent actions rather than empty words, that he had truly changed. As they sat together under the dim clinic lights, neither of them noticed the black sedan idling across the street, watching quietly, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. The next morning, Vincent received an urgent call from one of his associates, warning him that a rival businessman named Marcus Bellwether had learned about his recent visits to the small town and was using the information to spread rumors, hoping to weaken Vincent's standing among his partners. Marcus had long resented Vincent's growing influence and saw this personal connection as an opportunity to paint him as distracted and vulnerable at a critical moment in their ongoing negotiations. Vincent understood immediately that his enemies would try to use Alina as leverage, either to pressure him into unfavorable business decisions or to damage his reputation beyond repair. Rather than panic, he made a decision that surprised even his closest associates. He called an urgent meeting, not to defend himself, but to announce that he was stepping back from certain aggressive dealings entirely, choosing instead to focus his resources on legitimate ventures he had already been quietly building for years. His associates were stunned, some supportive, others clearly uneasy about the sudden shift in direction. Vincent stood firm, explaining calmly that his priorities had changed, and that he refused to let anyone use the people he cared about as tools in a power struggle. Marcus, upon hearing of Vincent's decision, mistakenly assumed this meant weakness and arranged a meeting, hoping to negotiate favorable terms while Vincent was seemingly distracted. Instead, Vincent arrived at the meeting composed and confident, laying out clear terms that protected his interests while firmly closing the door on any further interference in his personal life. He made it clear, without raising his voice, that any attempt to involve Alina or her child in business matters would end any possibility of future cooperation between them. Marcus, recognizing the seriousness in Vincent's tone, backed down, realizing he had underestimated the resolve behind Vincent's calm exterior. With that threat resolved peacefully, Vincent returned to the small town, arriving just as Alina's contractions began earlier than expected. He rushed her to the hospital, staying by her side through hours of anxious waiting, holding her hand as she pushed through exhaustion and pain. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and crying loudly, Alina looked up at Vincent with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude for his steady presence throughout the entire ordeal. In the quiet hours that followed, as Alina rested with her newborn daughter, Vincent sat beside the hospital bed, reflecting on everything that had led him to this moment. He realized that true strength was not measured by fear or control, but by the willingness to change, to show up consistently, and to choose the people who mattered most over everything else he had once believed defined him. Alina, watching him hold her daughter with such gentle care, finally allowed herself to imagine a future where trust could be rebuilt, not through grand promises, but through everyday actions proven over time. Vincent looked up at her, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face, and promised quietly that he intended to spend the rest of his life earning that trust back, one day at a time. As sunlight filled the hospital room the next morning, Alina and Vincent sat together, watching their daughter sleep peacefully between them, both aware that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would finally face them side by side.